Hi, my name is Frederick Dunn, and I keep honeybees here in the northeastern United States in the state of Pennsylvania in a very cold climate. So I've been keeping bees for many years, and I study hive equipment and evaluate honeybee behavior. So today we're answering your questions for thebeekeeper.org, and I want to thank you for submitting those. But if you did not get your question covered in this video, don't worry, someone will be in touch with you soon about that. So let's get right into it. And the first question comes from Michael. Michael lives in Southwest Victoria, Australia. Should I remove the queen excluder over winter? There are plenty of honey reserves in both the brood box and the super, so they shouldn't run short of sustenance. Winters here are generally cool, but temperatures here on the coast don't usually drop below zero, and then only rarely. Queen excluder is currently in place. Well, a lot of the answers that I'm going to give today on these questions are relevant to beekeeping almost everywhere, but primarily, of course, based on my experience in a place that gets a heavy winter over an extended period of time. And when it comes to the queen excluder, over winter, if you have a flow hive, for example, or a flow super, not only should you remove the queen excluder, but you should remove the honey super, the flow super itself. So the bottom boxes are for the bees. We have the bottom brood box, then you have probably an intermediate box, another honey super, and then your flow hive. So right under the flow hive is your queen excluder. Queen excluder might look something like this. It's designed to keep the queen below and out of your honey so that she doesn't lay her eggs. What happens if you left that on during winter? Well, the cluster is going to move up to take advantage of the resources that are in the hive. And we don't want to leave the queen behind. If they start producing drones in spring, you don't want to leave those behind either. So after you've done your final honey takeoff of the upper box, your flow super, for example, remove it. It's a great time to do maintenance. Let the bees clean it up, put it in storage, and do not have a queen excluder in place because we don't want the queen to be left behind if your workforce inside that hive moves up into those stored resources during winter. She has to be able to move with the cluster, be protected by them, and also so that she can raise some brood during winter. So yes, remove the queen excluder. Go right on to the next question. Zainab from London in the United Kingdom. In terms of materials for my beekeeping, what are the most important things to consider when buying the hive? And number two, I have an allotment to put the neighbors have a hive also. And so my question will be, one hive full of bees interact negatively with another hive full of bees, although they aren't right next to each other. So first of all, the hive equipment. Well, that's a matter of personal preference and also based on the kind of beekeeping you want to do. Where are you going to live? And what are the temperatures where you live? And also find out what other beekeepers are using successfully. The most popular design hive in the world is going to be the Langstroth hive. Very good material quality. You want to make sure it's preserved well for winter, and you want to make sure that the pieces all meet up good without a bunch of drafting and venting that you don't control. So aside from that, once you've got your woodenware set up, where you're going to place it is the other key thing. Also, a nice sturdy stand to put it on, and if you don't have predators where you live, some people do put it right on a piece of concrete or so forth, right on the ground. Other people like to elevate their hives. That's easier for you to work with, by the way, too. So as far as hive equipment goes, it comes down to personal preference. There are generally 8 frame or 10 frame hive sizes. Now the other question is your neighbor. If you have other bees nearby, will they get along? Sure they will, because they're going to forage on their own. Every time we bring in a pollinator, we have a bee that's going to be competing with native bees and other domesticated managed bees like the honeybee. And as long as there's forage in the area, they're not really going to impact one another. They're certainly not going to attack one another. They don't establish territory the way some other animals do. So having your hive in your yard and your neighbor has another hive in their yard, they should get along just fine. But things to consider when buying a hive, it comes down to how much you're willing to spend too. It won't be a secret that my favorite beehive of all time is going to be the Flow Hive 2. And it would be the Flow Hive 2 7 frame because we get in cold areas, and that's a 7 frame Flow Super, which is the 10 frame Langstroth matchup. So in colder areas, that's my favorite hive. So if money's no object, get one of those. Otherwise, the second most popular recommendation I would give, or if you're economy minded, would be any of the Langstroth hives that you can get a hold of. The next question from Richard in Washington State, here in the United States. I give my bees a medium super for their winter stores before I put on my flow hive. Would you suggest over supering or under supering the box with the flow frames? I always recommend if you over supering the box, your flow hive, your flow super should always be above the brood box. Then there's a honey super to get your bees through winter, then your flow super over that. Now, if you want to add surplus boxes above that, you can certainly do it. It really doesn't matter what the order is. Sometimes your bees may actually pass through your flow super and into a medium standard frame box and use that as well. So it's up to you and how much space you think your bees are going to successfully work, how many resources they're going to bring on board. Don't oversize your boxes as compared to the population of that hive. So in general, over supering, under supering, we like the flow super to be on top, generally speaking. So if you've got overproductive bees, or if you want to do cut comb or something like that, you can go above that. So I hope I answered that question. Seems like a pretty simple answer there. Next is from Sarah. Sarah lives in Tasmania, Australia. First year of beekeeping, and she had a frustrating time with bees, slow to take to the super and fill the frames. Then, towards the end of the season, they became extremely vicious. Some uncapped honey in the super. She was inspecting the brood box, and there was a fair bit of capped honey in one frame. But then all hell broke loose. Bees attacked and gave her many stings through the suit. Without a suit, they would have killed me, in parentheses here. I've been told I probably lost the queen, but what to do now as we are at the start of winter? There's a lot of things in Sarah's comment here that I want to talk about. Number one is to always have personal protective equipment handy when you're going to get into your beehives, especially if you're going to get into the brood areas and the areas that are critical to the bees. That's where they're going to most likely be unhappy about your visit. If you've got even borderline defensive bees, if they're going to react, they're going to do it when you get in there. So there's some things that weren't talked about here. Was smoke used before getting into the hive? What was the disposition of this hive beforehand? Had they been docile before? Did they suddenly change? And we're at the end of the season, so what happens at the end of the season? When are bees happiest? Bees are happiest when there's a nectar flow on. They're the most approachable when there's a nectar flow on because all the resources are coming in. They're fat and happy, and they're not defending much because they're too busy bringing things on board. So when do things get tenuous? When do they get cranky, some people like to say? Well, after that's over with, when the nectar flow is in decline, when there aren't new resources coming into the beehive, that's when a lot of robbing starts to happen too, because you've got this surplus workforce of foragers. And the foragers like to be employed. They want to be doing something. So they're flying around, and that's when they start pinging on other colonies of bees to find out if they can get in there and get their resources, because the environment's not yielding anything. So I think this is the time frame we're talking about with Sarah. So then during this period, we have a lot of extra bees, because that's the other thing. Heavily populated hives can also launch more guards, more defensive bees than they otherwise would at other parts of the year when they don't have so many defenders. So that's the other thing. There are more bees willing to sting you then. So the other thing is, but I do want to address that she said that had she not had her bee suit on, the bees would have killed her. Well, I want to put that into perspective a little bit. If you are allergic to bees, then your risks of being exposed to a defensive colony and receiving stings, of course, are very high. And those aren't normal. I mean, you might have anaphylaxis. You might go into shock when you're stung by bees. And that doesn't necessarily mean 100 or more bees. But let's go from the point of being a healthy person with normal immune system, not compromised, you're not sensitive to bees. The rule of thumb is that you can take 10 stings per pound of body weight. So really when people get stung 50, 60 times, that is a terrible experience, and you could have swelling and you could have discomfort and everything else, and you could panic, of course. But unless you're already sensitive to the bees, it's been said that that would not be a lethal dose of bee venom. So put that in your mind so that you can relax a little bit. That doesn't mean stand there and just continually receive stings. Our goal is not to be stung, of course. And then wear very good protective bee suits. The fact that these stung through the suit is an eye-opener too, because most generally speaking, bee suits don't allow them access. So if you've got a hot hive like this, you would want to be wearing long sleeves, long pants, and everything else under your bee suit as well, because all we're trying to do is create a space between that outer piece of fabric and your skin that stinger can't reach. So once the stinger goes in, can it reach your skin? That's the other part. Now, the other thing here is too, we're talking about whether or not to requeen, but we didn't verify whether the queen is present. So we need to get in there, even though the hive is hostile. If the hive is hostile, walk away. Come back another time. Let them cool down. You know, how far do they follow you? If they're following you 50, 60, 100 feet, and you've got 10 scouts, 10, defenders of the hive, 10 guard bees that are after you, that can seem like a lot, because there's 10 bees that don't like you and are trying to get their stingers in you. That can seem like a lot. But if they stop when you're 200 feet away, 300 feet away, so then you should be okay to come back later. Now, if we're talking, do 1,000 bees come out of the hive? Do 2,000 bees come out of the hive? Are you really mobbed? Are you in a cloud of defensive bees? You might have a real problem there, and that's when it's time to bring in someone with more experience that can help you evaluate that hive. But let's say that they're just difficult to deal with. Come back later. Midday would be good. Fewer bees in the colony, fewer bees in the hive. There are more foragers are out. If you're dealing with guards and you want to use smoke, one of the things that I use to calm bees that are defensive like that is I put essential oils in sugar syrup and spray them with that. Heavy dose of essential oils, because it also serves to calm them down. It also competes with their pheromones, because they are releasing pheromones when they're defensive. You want to get in the hive and you want to look to see if in fact you have a queen or not. It's true that a queenless colony may be a little more defensive. It's also at the end of the year when they're trying to defend their resources. If you have a queen, then you don't have to worry about requeening. So the other thing is, what if you have a queen and they're defensive? What would I do? We're going into winter. This also depends on where you live. Are you in a neighborhood, for example, where other people might be put at risk by being in close proximity to a defensive hive of bees? If you're like me and you live in a rural area where you don't have immediate neighbors and where defensive bees could be evaluated or studied or dealt with over an extended period of time, you can at your leisure see what they do and if their disposition changes. And this is also why I say bring in a more experienced beekeeper who's dealt with hot bees to see how dangerous potentially they actually are. So if you have a queen going into winter, you can't requeen because there are no drones to mate with the queen. The weather could turn bad and she can't complete her mating flights. Therefore, you have a sterile, infertile queen, and you're not going to reproduce in winter, so you're probably going to lose the colony. Now, if you still have a queen in there, because we need to do that inspection, we need to look for eggs and evidence that she's there. If you do have a hot queen and you're going into winter and you live in a rural area, I say let her carry those bees through into spring. And then when spring gets there, if they've survived, I would requeen her with a docile queen, assuming that the behavior is still hot in spring. So reevaluate at the end of winter as you're going into spring and think about replacing the queen then if it's necessary. So we need to find out, is it a hot hive or is it a dangerous hive? Those are very different things. If it turned out to be a dangerous hive, you're going to have to solicit the help of someone else and deal with the colony and potentially even eliminate the colony if they're a threat to people, livestock, things like that. So the other thing is what's going on around that hive. Predators may be coming and harassing your bees at night. Other things may be happening. So if you have any ability to provide surveillance on the hive, if you could put cameras out there, motion detector, game cameras, trail cameras, things like that would pick up on the fact that maybe a skunk visits them at night. I don't know what's in Tasmania, what kind of animals might be bothering your bees at night. So they might already be on the defense when you go out to check your bees, is the line of thought I'm giving you there. So finding out what's going on with them as a whole and really doing a thorough inspection, even though they're hot. Suit up, get back in there, check your bees, find out what's really going on. If they're queenless, they're pretty much doomed anyway. Personal protective equipment, foremost. The next question is from Robin. Is it possible to install an ideal super with foundationless frames or a full depth brood box with plastic frames? Can and will the bees adapt? Okay, honeybees deal with any kind of frame that you want to put in. So often when it comes to the deep brood box, we may start with foundationless frames there because your bees will build their own comb. That's where they're going to raise their brood. That's where they're storing pollen. They'll have some nectar and honey. It's an all-purpose beginning box for your beehive. So generally people like to do foundationless there. Now, if you go to the honey super, once that starts to be full and you put on the next super, a medium box, for example, it doesn't matter. You can have foundationless up there. You can put plastic frames that are pre-waxed. You can have plastic foundation. You can have pre-drawn comb like hexacomb. So there are any number of options. Bees automatically use up the space that you provide them with. So that is not a problem at all. So if you want to put up ideal super with foundationless frames, the bees adapt to any kinds of frames you put up there. I mean, bees will put honeycomb inside jars. So if the colony is strong, they will use the space and they adapt to any kind of frame. Now, sometimes there are frames that they don't like. There could be a plastic frame, for example, that's of a material that the bees just naturally reject. Maybe it doesn't have enough actual beeswax on it to prime it to get them going. So bees given choices, and this is some of the things that I've done in the past in my material evaluations, is to determine what kinds of frames bees use first. So we do know that if you're using plastic frames, of all the frames on the market that I've evaluated, the heavy waxed acorn plastic frames and acorn plastic foundation, if you need a plastic piece, they draw those out before all of the other manufacturers. Now, the other comb that people are putting in their hives now is called hexacomb, and it is a pre-drawn synthetic comb that the bees go after first before others. So, and then of course, they'll adapt to any type, but you can, and then if you want foundationless comb in there, you can just put in the wooden frames. You can prime that with wax. You don't have to. It's been my experience that my bees use foundationless comb readily. They just start building with gravity. So if you align everything right, you keep everything pushed together so there's not a lot of space beyond bee space, and that your hives are nice and level, they will use whatever comb you put in there. Ultimately, they make use of all space available. So they adapt. So what's the next question here? Mary Louise, Andalusia, Spain. I bought a nuke from a local store, just bees and a queen, no frames with brood, etc. So normally, the terminology here, a nuke stands for a nucleus, which means it would be a small colony of bees that has brood, resources, everything already in it, and a laying queen. So I think what we're describing here, Mary Louise is describing a package that comes with a mated queen in a separate cage, usually something like this. And then in a package, 3 pounds, 5 pounds of worker bees that will sustain her while she gets going. And I feed them with sugar syrup through a feeder on top of the hive under the lid. And now a lot of ants are intruding the feeder, and some of the ants are big. What do I do to keep, what can I do to stop the ants and not harm the bees? Water is no option because it evaporates rapidly on a winter climate. Well, there's a lot of things you can do to keep the ants out of your beehive. Mostly, ants are not doing anything negative to the bees. They're usually trying to occupy the space that the bees are not using. That's why you usually find them under the cover of your hive, on top of the inner cover, tucked in the back. You'll see a bunch of ants with their eggs, and they're all scurrying around. But so the first line of defense for that is to have your hives up off the ground. Have a hive stand that you can create barriers on. Now, Mary Louise says can't put water. What she means by that is some people have hive stands that have a moat designed around it, so you fill that with water, and then the bees can't, they get into the water and they drown, so they can't get up into the hive. So I would put my hive up on something that has 4 legs. that are like pipe stands and things like that, because now you can actually grease those legs and prevent the ants from getting up there. If the ants are already up there, you want to open your cover and vacuum them off the inner cover, sweep them out, whatever you want to do. But once you have your hive up on a controllable stand where it's not in full contact and grass and everything is not leaning against it either, because if grass and bushes and stuff touch your hive, ants and other insects use that to access the structure itself. So if you put it up on stands, now you can grease the legs. You can put ants are pheromone based, by the way. Honeybees are related to ants. They're a social insect. Ants are following scent trails, so if you can disrupt those scent trails, you disrupt their ability to follow one another up or down. You don't have to necessarily kill them, you can deter them. So first vacuum them out of the hive, get all the ones off the hive that you can, and then have a barrier on the legs themselves. That's the most effective. If you put grease on there, it lasts the longest. You can also put mint toothpaste, things like that. They don't like the smell of it, but greasing is what I would suggest. The other thing is prevent them from getting into the hive. Ants like to go in through the back door. So they're looking for a crack, they're looking where the boxes go together. This is why they like to go up the side and get in that telescoping cover. You need to seal up the little openings where the ants are getting in. So you can tuck things in there to make sure that that's airtight and then therefore ant tight. So we want to keep them out. But that's my recommendation for that. Get the hive off the ground. If it's on the ground, nothing leaning on it, and just take away their access to the hive. And then, of course, grease. They even sell sticky grease that's designed to keep ants from climbing up trees and plants that may be available at your home center. It stays tacky and sticky, and anything climbing up the leg gets stuck on it and can't cross the barrier. So that's it for the ants. Next is from Simon in Australia. Added super mid-April, bees did not fill the frames. Tried rubbing some of the generated wax over the plastic super frames, but to no avail. Has since removed the super and left them in the brood box only. Still have lots of numbers, so the queen is all good. Have I left it too late to get them interested in the super, i.e. the super and brood would be too much for them to handle for coming winter months? Do I have to wait until springtime before I add the super back on? If so, when would be the best time? Well, here's one of the things about it, and with the super, I think we're talking about the flow super. People tend to have troubles getting some of their bees to start to work the flow frames themselves. And one of the things that I like to look at with that is there a queen excluder underneath that flow super? And normally there is, because that's the setup. You would have your bottom brood box, which would sit on your landing board. So if this is a brood box right here, this is your landing board. And this would be the super. Anything above that brood box is considered a super. So now normally people put the queen excluder right under here, and then there's the flow super, and then we wonder why there's problems getting the bees up in here. Now this does have something to do also with the line of bees that you keep. Some bees take readily to flow frames, and other bees do not. But one of the things that slows it down is that queen excluder. So I would say run a test. Take the queen excluder off. So you've got your brood box, take the queen excluder off, put that flow super back on, assuming you still have enough time in the nectar flow, and see the bees start to work those flow frames. Then once they have been working them for a while, once you see them mending the little seams and joints in the flow frames, and we know for sure that the queen is down below, make sure you find her. Then you put the queen excluder back in there. Because now they've started to work them, they've got resources begun there, and so you'll have your workers more inclined to go up through the queen excluder and in there. Sometimes I've found that the queen excluder itself, especially the plastic ones, can very much slow down, or even your bees accept that as a barrier, and sometimes they just start to seal it all up with propolis. So once they start propolizing that queen excluder, they're less apt to get through it in the first place, and they're more inclined to just confine themselves in that lower box. So you could add another medium honey super on that box instead of the flow super at all, to make sure that they have resources for winter. Because based on the way this is written, going into the winter months right now, so you're going to have to pull off your flow super anyway, if that's what we're talking about. You don't want that on during winter, and we don't want a queen excluder on during winter, again, as I mentioned before, because it would hold the queen down below resources that they otherwise might migrate into for winter resources to survive. So, but when we're talking about your bees not using your flow supers in general, try it without the queen excluder. See if your bees go up in there. I've given this advice to people in the past that have had problems with getting your bees to accept the flow super plastic frames. And by getting the queen excluder out, they've had instant success with their flow super now. So often it's the queen excluder itself that somehow gets the bees to accept an intermediate barrier and not go beyond it. We even had one case where the bees went up, used the whole flow super, and then there was an extraction done. We took the honey off from that flow super, and then just as a general practice, put the queen excluder in underneath of it, and guess what they did? They took all their honey out of the flow super and migrated all to the boxes below that queen excluder, and then they propolised the queen excluder as if it were a propolis trap or something like that. So I would do that test. Take the queen excluder out, see if the bees then go up and use, because I've never primed my flow hives, flow supers, with wax, or never sprayed them with sugar water, never done anything, and my bees use those flow supers readily. What I don't personally do is I don't have a queen excluder. But that's because I have the deep brood box, and then I've got a second box, a super on top of that gets full of honey first. Then I put my flow super on there. And you might think that that's a waste, because if you live in Australia, you may think that you're in a climate where, because this is not modeled by the flow hive inventors, the practice is to have the bottom brood box and let them fill up, and then put a queen excluder on, and then your flow super. But nothing stops you from putting another box on before the flow super and seeing if they fill that also. And if they do, now you have a honey bridge, I call it. Then I put my flow super above that with no queen excluder. So you would think, doesn't that take them more time? Well, if you have ever observed a queen excluder, it slows down production. It also prevents some of the workers from even passing through it. They just give up on it. They don't push through the queen excluder. And of course, what we just talked about, they may actually use the queen excluder as a barrier and attempt to seal it up and create the inner cover out of that queen excluder. So take it off, try it out, and see what happens. And then, of course, make sure your queen is down below, reinstated after they've used that flow super once. Try it and see. Next is from Michael in Dublin, Ohio. What is the best treatment for ticks near the hive? I have ticks this year, but I have concerns about how to treat safely. I live in a residential but somewhat rural area with horse pastures next to the hives, thus lots of space, which I cannot treat. Again, I'm always against pesticides, period. So some of the suggestions I'm going to make here for Michael, first of all, ticks. So now we're talking about what bothers people. Ticks don't bother your bees. So we're talking about getting things under control. You may not like what I'm going to say. I like natural controls. So if you want ticks and fleas and creepy crawlies that run around near your hives, you may consider a flock of free-ranging chickens. You might consider a flock of African guinea fowl, which are great at eating ticks and stuff. You also, we have wildlife that eats ticks, like possums and things like that. So if you could add other birds and things around your property that would eat the ticks, that would be the other thing. Ticks like to be on tall grass, so mow everything down. I'm not saying that you're not mowing your property. I'm not saying that you're not keeping things well groomed down. But ticks like to be on tall grass and stuff, and then they cling to animals as they pass through it. So get rid of the tall grass, maybe consider attracting more birds and things that feed on the ticks. I will never endorse the use of pesticides, especially because ticks are so far-ranging. You would have to broadcast that everywhere. It's not like we find the tick nest and then take care of them. So that's my high recommendation. I've had African guinea fowl, flocks of 20 or more, And you will not find ticks or bugs because they spend their entire day, just like free-ranging chickens, they run all over, and they'll run 50 feet, 100 feet just to get a little moth that's flitting around in the grass. So there are other ways to do that. You could also attract more wild birds with bird feeders. And the more birds and things like that in the area, they scavenge. Chipping sparrows, grass sparrows, things like that roam around on the ground and they hunt every bug they can find. So rather than thinking of the pesticide angle, I would go towards grooming the landscape a little bit and inviting in other things that might feed on those ticks. Next is from Mish, or Mish maybe. When a hive decides to swarm, is it always the old queen that takes the bees with her, or does a virgin queen sometimes take them? Also, can a hive swarm more than once in a season? The answer is yes on both counts. Here's what happens. Early in spring, first of all, swarming, that's what they do. So when they reproduce and they build up, when we're looking at a beehive, and you're looking at the reproduction of the superorganism, which is the entire colony of bees, they're going to generate another colony of bees. So the old queen is going to leave well before the queen cells that are inside that hive, sometimes before they're even capped, but usually right at the time of the capping of those cells, that's when the old queen flies out. So there's already a span of time between when the queen leaves and now there's a bunch of queen cells left over. I've seen colonies generate 6, 7, or 8 queen cells at a time, which for me is great. We get to observe the behavior. We get to see which queen comes out first. We get to listen to the queen piping inside her cell before she comes out. We get to hear the other queens piping in their cells. So what happens? Well, they just swarmed out. So the old queen has departed with a huge percentage of the colony, up to 70% of the bees in the initial swarm, the first swarm of the year, let's say. Huge part of the population leaves, strong colony, all kinds of bees went with her. Now a new queen hatches out, and we have something that's known as an after swarm. So you might be so frustrated. You have this great colony of bees. They're so populated. They're so productive. They're my favorite bees. They just swarmed. Okay, finally that's over with. You catch them. You put them in a box. 4 days later, 5 days later, the exact same colony emits another swarm. Off they go, and they're on the same tree branch that you just caught the other one from. So the queen that's in that swarm, is she mated? Not if it happened within just a few days of the other swarm. And then colonies can swarm even again. And we've found as many as 2 or 3 queens in the same swarm cluster. And why are they clustering? But there'll be one queen in particular that they're more inclined to go towards, because you can catch both queens and you can hang them on separate branches and see where the clusters form, and they always tend to follow one queen. So we've got an infertile queen over here whose pheromone is inferior. They're not following her. She's not mated. So it is possible that there are other swarms that occur from the same colony. It is also possible that they swarm following a non-mated queen. And that's why sometimes when you collect a small swarm, I've collected them as small as, your hands. That's even late season last year, we got a swarm, an after swarm that small, because they were coming out of a colony that was in a building and they just kept generating swarm after swarm. And of course, they were progressively smaller. So I took the smallest collection, and what did they do? The bees land on the landing board, and they occupy the landing board in huge numbers, and they kept opening their Nasonov glands, which are at the tail end of the abdomen of the bee, and they're sending that scent out into the air a lot. Now that's normal when you hive a brand new swarm. When you stick them in there, they need to let the other members of that colony know that this is where they live now, and they're spreading generally the queen's pheromone. But a few days after that, you find the same colony, and you find that there are still a bunch of workers on the landing board, and they're still doing the Nasonov gland exposure, and they're spreading that pheromone into the air. What do you think they're doing now? So what's happened is the queen matured a little bit, because a queen that just hatches out, she can't fly and mate yet. She has to toughen up. She has to gain her strength. So they don't hatch, fly out, mate, come back, and take care of your colony. Several days happen while that queen matures. 9 days could happen before the queen makes any kind of flight. So then when she makes her flight, this is a swarm that you've collected, so you actually had an infertile queen in there. She flies out, and now they're all on the landing board. They're helping the queen find her way back to them. It's very interesting stuff. So even though you've collected the swarm, because it's an after swarm, it's likely that she may not have been mated. So now after you've hived them, that's when she does her mating flight and goes out and comes back fertilized with mating sign on her, which is usually the genitals of the last male that she mated with in that drone congregation area. So yes, it happens a lot. And can a hive swarm more than once in a season? Absolutely. Really strong colonies can emit several swarms during a season. I have an observation hive. One of the 17 hives that I keep right now is an observation hive, and they just build their population in there. It only has 8 frames, and once they get strong, they send out a swarm. 5-6 days later, they send out another one, and we collect those, hive those, and then observe their behavior. So yes, it happens a lot. Next question from Dylan in North Carolina. I would like to know how Fred's Saskatraz bees are doing. Also, is there a feeder that can be used to fit under the Flow Hive 2 7-frame roof without doing any modifications? For those of you who don't know, there's a line of bees here in the United States called the Saskatraz bees. They come from Saskatchewan, Canada, and they're being bred in the state of California. And last year I bought a bunch of those as packages, flew them in, and started using them. Let me tell you something. They are my best honey producing bees that I have ever owned, and they use the flow hives perfectly. So the Saskatraz bees' temperament is great. They did require Varroa destructor treatment last year. This year they're looking really good. We bought in a couple more packages of them because we're doing horizontal hive evaluations this year, and we're using the Saskatraz bees for those. So let me just tell you, thumbs up on the Saskatraz bees all the way around. They're doing fantastic. I've done some other follow-up videos on them, and we're going to be evaluating the horizontal hive with the Saskatraz bees in it coming soon on my YouTube channel. So, is there a feeder that can be used? Now this is another thing. Those of us who live in cold weather would like to put hive top feeders inside our flow hives. My favorite configuration for a vertical hive right now is the Flow Hive 2, and the 7-frame Flow Hive 2 is my favorite of that group. And what I want to do is, I've got the lid here. So this is a Flow Hive 7-frame, which is matched up with the 10-frame Langstroth hive. And what do we want to do? We want to put, my favorite hive top feeder is a rapid round feeder. This particular rapid round feeder, since we're here and talking about it, I put the ankle portion of a child's cotton sock over that center riser there, and when we put syrup in here, that gives the bees something to hang on to. It wicks up the liquid syrup, and the bees can drink here, no drowned bees. Just wanted to mention that. Now we get in here, and this is to show you the depth of this. And this is the largest roof that you can get in a flow hive. So if this is placed underneath, does it fit? Can you use it without any shimming or modification of the flow hive? You can use it that way. This is the shoulder right here that it rests on, which would be the inner cover that it rests on. But it will raise up because it's actually going to rest on the shoulder of this rapid round feeder. So it will come up about 1/4 of an inch off the shoulder, so the roof will actually be resting on the top of your rapid round feeder. So the next part of the question is there a feeder that goes under there? To me, not one that holds enough syrup to make it practical to use. So you can use it as is, but if you just make a 3/4 inch shim that you put around on top of the inner cover, then this is the inner cover for a flow hive. If you just put a 3/4 inch piece of wood around the top, 3/4 inch thick, now you will accommodate that rapid round feeder without any further modification. So the modification is simple. It would be really great if the Flow Hive 2, 7 or 6 frame Both came with an option to buy an extended or a taller roof that would accommodate larger feeders, because those of us who live in cold climates where we get heavy winters would really benefit from being able to put dry food on that inner cover, utilizing that central feeding hole, and so that we can take care of our bees in winter. So that should answer Dylan's questions. Next is Chris from Michigan. Long cold winter in parentheses here. Started hive in May. So far, bees have filled a medium 8 frame, so I added a second brood deep 8 frame box. Expect to be about 80% completed by the end of June. If I add the flow super now and remove their honey collected by September, August, will they have enough honey in the brood chambers to make it through the long winter? Can I remove one of the frames in the super and add 2 foundationless frames to collect comb? Will that work? This kind of a question, this is all relative to how productive your bees are. So what I like to do, of course, is have the deep box full, and it's primarily brood, and then it's, bee bread, so you've got your pollen stores, you've got your honey stored there as well around the fringes of those frames. Then when we put the next box up and they fill that with honey, those are sacred boxes just for the bees if you're living in an area where there's going to be a long winter. I personally would not be pulling one of those frames to see if I can get cut comb. Nothing is more expensive resource-wise to the bees than making brand new comb. So I personally would not do that, especially just before you're getting into winter, because they don't have the opportunity to recover those resources before you go. But, and these are 8 frames, which is not the end of the world too, 8 and 10 frame. The bees don't normally, when people get the big 10 frame boxes, which I use a lot of, but I also use the 8 frame boxes, they seem to winter equally, 8 or 10 frame. Why is that? There's more honey in a 10 frame. Well, because they tend to ignore the first position and the 10th position frames when they're going through winter and they're using their honey resources, because the cluster tends to migrate straight up through the boxes and they tend to occupy kind of the same space. Although I have seen them kind of cut an angle through the box as they go up, they don't spread out and they don't clear their plate. They don't eat every resource from all of these frames as they move up and then eat all the resources from those frames. They keep their cluster, they control their warmth, and they move up, and they also have a tiny bit of brood in the middle of that as they go. So it's the vertical space that they need. When they get to the top and you get warmer days, if you're lucky and we get some warm days in the wintertime, that's when they move around and start to access other resources in the hive. So would I be taking that out at the end of the year and using cut comb? So cut comb is the most expensive thing you can take out of a beehive, period. And enough honey in the brood chambers, that's up to you. You have to weigh it. You have to know. Because sometimes that deep brood box, even though it is the brood box, it can have 30 or 40 pounds of honey in it as well. So a medium box weighs about 47 pounds. So if you're talking about frame by frame, how much does a deep frame of honey weigh? Right about 8 pounds. So if we put that in kilograms, it's 3.62 kilograms per frame. So when you're estimating based on your climate what your bees think they're going to need. Now I made a mistake last year, because I've always left almost 100 pounds of honey on every hive through winter, and then in the springtime, guess what happened? There was a whole bunch of surplus honey. We had to take it all off in the spring as the spring nectar flow came in, and a lot of the honey, sometimes it would get mold on it and stuff like that, because the hive was so big that the colony inside could not take advantage of and ventilate and keep dry and take care of the surface of all of that capped honey in there. So then I dropped back to just having a medium surplus box on. So there's 47 pounds to 50 pounds of honey on there. And I left that on, and that worked for 2 years in a row. And then last year they used all of their honey in that top box. So they migrated up quickly to the top box, leaving a bunch of resources down here. And then they consumed everything up here. And then we went to what we call emergency feeding, which was dry sugar in the feeding space above. So leave them with more. Don't take off resources at the very end of the season going into winter. You do have to remove your flow super. That can't be on through winter for obvious reasons. and that's it. So I would not do that. Going into winter, you can overestimate the resources they have. Better to have a surplus in the spring. Take it off then. Next is from Mike S., southeastern Wisconsin. Installed a nuke at the end of April and added a second brood box with foundationless frames. The bees built comb from the bottom upwards on the foundationless frames, lots of cross comb, with honey, no eggs or larvae. Remove the second brood box and put a flow super on. Why would the bees build comb from the bottom of the frames instead of from the wooden strip at the top of the frame? Now what's being described there is pretty rare, but again, I'm going to take out my miniature education hive here. So if this is the bottom box, this represents a 10 frame, so all the frames are in here, and the bees filled all this up and drew out all the frames, and everything was great. Another thing I want to talk about here, because of the cross combing, your hives can tilt forward and back. That's okay. But when it comes to side, they have to be absolutely level, especially when we're using foundationless frames, because the bees build in total darkness and they build according to gravity. So if these frames tip from side to side, you get comb that goes cattywampus. Also, the bees can start to join and bridge comb to other frames adjacent to those. So then what's being described here is, in the next box, you have a wooden frame, and the bees started to build their wax down here instead of up here on the top. So, like little stalagmites, they started to raise up here, but I think you'll also find that if we looked at the two boxes, the way they're stacked here, I think you'll find that this bottom box was full of comb, that they also bridged these two frames together, one over the top, and that what the bees actually started to do is just continue building their wax up here along the bottom, because this only really happens when you have two boxes and they start to build down here. You won't see a single box by itself with the bees building from the bottom. I've never seen it. They always go to the top of the box and work their way down. So the reason I think this happened is because they continued their comb through this and then started to arch up into here and build their comb up from the bottom box up into the next box up. So what should you do? You have to pull those frames out. You have to cut all the wax off of them. Now these are just suggestions, of course. You'll follow whoever you want to when it comes to teaching you how to manage your comb and your boxes. But I would cut away personally all of those stray bits of comb, and I would clean off that bottom, and I would clean off the connective comb between those two frames, one directly below or above the other. Then I would also rearrange the frames. So the ones that are in the middle, move them to the outside, move the ones outside to the middle, and things like that. So there's no matching up of comb material underneath. And then they should correct themselves. So what else are we talking about? It only happens with foundationless frames, by the way. So level it, cut away all that stuff, try it again. When it says with no honey, no eggs, no larvae, I think we're talking about up in the new frames. If there's no honey, eggs, or larvae in the whole thing, you have a whole different kind of pickle going on there. That would be a queenless colony, but I think he's only talking about what's up there. So, and also when you put those frames back, I would go ahead and prime the underside of the upper part of those frames, the top bar of those frames, with beeswax. In fact, use the beeswax that you cut off. Remelt it and smear that up there. And then that will encourage them to start to pull and work on that. Next one comes from Penny in North Carolina. I've heard that honey from oilseed rape sets like concrete, and to extract this immediately. Is this so? And what is the best way to protect my flow hives if this is the case? Well, as I mentioned in the beginning, I do a lot of material evaluation with bees and bee equipment. And one of the things we did is we let the bees put all kinds of honey in the flow supers, and we let it solidify there to see what we could do about it. And I can tell you when it comes to this rapeseed honey, it has a tendency to solidify or crystallize, whatever the term is you want to use, which, by the way, there's nothing wrong with that honey. Totally usable, totally good to go. What happens is we have a mechanized frame that relies on gravity and draining of the honey to get it out. So usually that source of honey, although it has the propensity to crystallize fairly fast, it generally doesn't do it unless you've left it in the frames for a long time. Here's one of the big advantages to the flow hive and the flow supers is that when we pull off that back and we can look at that, we can see that the cells are being filled with honey. Another thing that you would be able to notice, if you know for sure that that's the kind of nectar they're getting into, as soon as you start to see those cells start to cloud up even a little bit, I would drain off that honey because that means it's starting to solidify. So you see, 2/3 or 3/4 of that frame is already capped. And because the other thing is all the frames might not be the same, so you don't have to do them all. You look at the one that looks like it's starting to solidify, it gets a little cloudy, you can't see through it, and they're starting to cap most of it. I would go ahead and take that off, and then I would use my refractometer to find out if you had enough moisture reduction to make that stable, so under 19% water. And so if that's good to go, I would drain it off, get it in the jars right away. Now let's say we failed at that. Let's say it's in the frames, we went on vacation, we goofed off, we did not look at our flow super, and now we look at it, and now it looks like it's already solidified. It's translucent, it's not transparent anymore. What can we do? Well, you can pull that flow frame out, and here's the other thing. Always have extra flow mechanized frames ready to go on the shelf. Why? So you can pull out a frame like that, because you can't leave it without the frame in place. We can't pull 3 frames, have the flow super still on, and now we've got this wide open space and the bees just go wild and connect everything. So always have brand new on hot standby flow frames ready to insert. So we pull out the ones that look like they've got solidified honey in them, replace them right away with nice, clean, brand new replacements, or those that you have on the shelf that you've cleaned up. And then you just take it in and just heat it up. So you can put that frame on the bench. You can heat it up to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 43.3 degrees Celsius. We don't want to make it really hot. Really hot, you damage the honey. If you want to preserve the raw properties of your honey, 110 degrees is pretty safe. Once you see that cloudiness go away, then activate it and drain it, because you can drain. Those frames function outside of your flow hive. So you can rack them up, heat them up, drain them off, and then you salvage it and put that frame out and let your bees clean it up. Don't let them clean it up right next to their hive. Put it well away from the hive. Let them clean it up elsewhere. Nobody will clean it like the bees will. And now you've got another frame on hot standby for the next time you need to pull an individual frame, and you can do it. So that's good to go. That's what I would do. Now, as far as that stuff routinely just solidifying so fast that you didn't have any time I've never personally experienced that. It'll solidify within a week sometimes in the jar. Once you've drained it off and left it there, you see it just gets cloudy almost right away. So, and a lot of that sometimes has to do with storage temperature and things like that. But that's how you can salvage a frame, and I would not hesitate to drain it off right away if I saw that. Next one is from Benji in eastern North Carolina. How long should it take a new mail order queen to start laying eggs once put in the queenless hive? Well, the queen that you purchase through mail order, and I do that sometimes. When I need to refresh my stock, I just order up a queen that's already been mated and she's ready to lay, and she comes with her workers, and then we put that in a colony that's queenless. I would like to mention that you shouldn't have your colony queenless for very long, so we're going to talk about that first. You can end up with a laying worker within 3 weeks of a queen being absent from a colony, so we want to avoid that. You want to get the new queen in right away. Now, so we've got a colony of bees. What are the resources that are available there? Are there already drawn comb? So if you have drawn out cells and the comb is ready to receive eggs from the queen could potentially start laying right away. You have a new queen, she's going to get in there, she's going to get acquainted with your bees. Your bees will probably accept her right away if they've been queenless for any period of time, but past the 3-week mark, you run the risk of having a laying worker, and then they could reject the queen when she comes. So we've got this 3 weeks or less time interval to get that queen in there, and you want it to be at least 3 days or more after you've had another queen in there, because we want that pheromone to dissipate and we want them to be queenless so they're willing to accept the new queen. So once she's there and they're all trying to feed the queen and you know that she's been accepted, and they will also start changing their behavior in the colony. So once the new queen is there and once they've accepted her, they start doing waxworks again. They start doing maintenance on the hive. They start bringing in more pollen and start storing it. So once these resources that are available in the environment stimulate the workers and the nurse bees, and they know that now that they can sustain new life in the colony, now that queen can start laying right away. Food and resources, place to lay, acceptance by the workers, she can lay right away. So you should be able to see eggs, and within the first week, you should start to see larvae. So the first 3 days, we'll have the eggs in there. On the 4th day, there'll be larvae, and the larvae have to be fed. So that's when the resources start kicking in. Bee bread, royal jelly, the nurse bees are doing all that they're supposed to do. And so you should see evidence of that. Now, once you put the new queen in, should you be checking on her in 3 or 4 days? No. You should be waiting a week or more before you look in there. We don't want to destabilize them. Every time we get in the hive, we are invaders, and we're not doing them any favors. How could you tell if they've accepted the queen, and if you think she's laying, and if they start feeding that brood? If there's larvae in there, what's going to be happening at the landing board? They're going to be bringing in pollen. They're going to bring in pollen at a pretty significant rate. So when you see that happening, yes, we have babies in the hive. It's that easy. You don't have to open it to know that she was accepted and that they're laying and that everything is great. But if you really, really have to see the queen and you really, really have to see what's going on, wait 12 days to 2 weeks to look in on them. And then keep it brief. Find what you need to know and get out. Next is Robbie, who lives in the Italian Alps. Interested in starting beekeeping? Lots of bees in the area during spring and summer. We have nice hot summers, but we of course have snow in the winter, and it can get down to minus 10 at night. So if that's minus 10 Celsius, that's 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Is it possible for me to have bees in this climate and altitude? And if so, what would I have to do in order to make sure they will survive winter? We've already discussed this a little bit. Now, I also did produce a video on YouTube called Wintering with Flow Hives, or Flow Hives in Cold Weather, whatever you want to say. And if you follow those guidelines, you can keep your bees in really cold weathers like this. Cold weather like this. So yeah, because look what's already said here. Lots of bees in the area during spring and summer. So there must be forage. There must be resources for these bees, because that's really key. Where I happen to live, we have hundreds of acres of wetland area that support my bees. So we have excellent forage. So that's what actually provides them with the diversity in the environment, floral diversity, pollen diversity, protein diversity, all the stuff that comes together to make for healthy, robust bees that can handle extended winters. So I think what Robbie's talking about here is very similar to the environment that we have where I live. When it gets that cold, again, really cold, as long as the hives are well constructed and there's no excess air movement in the hive. This is where these upper vents can really be detrimental, because the bees have to consume calories. They have to burn calories to generate enough heat to keep themselves alive through winter. And if it's vented through the top, that cool air is passing up from the bottom, going right through and out, and they've lost their controlled heat area around their cluster. So a properly insulated cover, a nicely built hive, a sizable cluster of bees that have the resources to go through winter. And often biologists will say, and entomologists will say, it's not the cold that kills the bees, it's starvation. But in order for the bees to handle that cold, they need to consume a lot of resources, and it's up to us to have them, and that's where the height comes in. Remember, they're going to move up at 1 millimeter a day through winter. And if it gets cold and stays cold, that actually works better for the bees. And if we get these warm-up snaps and it gets cold again, warm again, cold again, because when they come out of torpor, they use more resources then because they're more active now. So there's a lot going on, but also what I would tell Robbie is, since there's already bees in the area, I would find out if there are other beekeepers. Certainly there must be. Find out what their losses are every year. Find out what they do to get through winter. And the other key thing too, source some local stock that's already handling it there. And if you've got wild bees, feral bees already in the Alps, in that region, I would look at setting out a swarm trap and trying to get a hold of some of those feral bees, because they're already acclimatized, they're already surviving on their own, and you can hive those and have a really remarkable first year beekeeping with some really good beekeeping equipment. Insulate the cover. Good bees. Next is from Andrea in Texas. Bugs are a big problem. Has not sprayed any pesticides, but is having a big problem with fire ants. I have had people recommend AMDRO, which reportedly sterilizes the fire ant queen, but does not actually kill the ants. Do you know if this has any effect on bees? Would it be safe to use to control the fire ant population without harming my bees? So I'm going to stop right there, because it's a two-part question. Super careful around pesticides and your honeybees. That particular thing that we're talking about, killing fire ants, I used to live in the South. I can't stand fire ants. They wait until there's 100 of them on you, and then they all start stinging you at one time. So not a fan of them. But these granules that you use on fire ants are pretty controlled. Now, normally I'm totally against pesticides, and I don't understand the complete mechanism that is used to kill these fire ants or sterilize the queen in this way. But because they are particulates that are picked up by the ants and carried down in, and then the queen is fed by these ants, and then she becomes sterile that way, the likelihood that that would find its way into a honeybee food chain is extremely low. So if you had to do that, I get it. Fire ants are ridiculous. They sting people. They've killed dogs on leashes. They're terrible. So it seems like the way it's delivered, that's what we have to think about when you're putting out anything to kill a pest. What else will likely feed on the pest once it's been hit with some kind of toxin? And the other thing is, what else has access to what you're feeding to it? So the honeybees, we're very concerned about plants, flowers, things that the bees are going to get on, water. So the water that the bees are going to use, that they're going to consume, they're going to bring into the hive and paint all over the surface to cool the hive and things like that, as well as drinking water. So if it gets into the water, that's a potential risk. If it's materially in the plants and the nectar, so then that's a risk to the bees. So it's in the pollen and things like that. So all of these things we have to consider when we're thinking about getting in the bees. So I don't want to say green light, totally safe to use. I will say that I'm highly skeptical that it would have an impact on your honeybees, and I completely understand wanting to control fire ants. Any suggestions on safely controlling chiggers, keeping wasps from building nests all over my house, eaves, and discouraging scorpions? I've tried several non-toxic herbal-based sprays that don't seem to have any noticeable effect. Well, the first thing that I would suggest is that you move to a new location. I'm just kidding. Here's the thing. A lot of what's being described here, number one, chiggers and things like that, these are very difficult to control. Much easier for you to put some kind of repellent on and then keep them from biting you. The other thing is these wasps. Now, wasps that are hanging out, wasps are not negative. You may want to look up a video that I've shown, which is a wasp versus wasp video. And the paper wasps that tend to build their little paper nests up underneath eaves and in the soffit zone and stuff like that of your house, these brown paper wasps, they are not detrimental to your honeybees. So I see them as they have a common enemy, which is the yellow jacket. So these paper wasps, having them around, they're generally not very defensive towards people coming and going. The other thing is I leave them in place if they're the little brown colored ones, not the yellow jackets. I leave them in place because, first of all, they take out so many other detrimental pests from your garden. For example, I've seen these wasps go, and I don't know if you know what bagworms are, but they'll be worms that form a web on tree branches and things like that, which protects the larvae while they're feeding away on all the leaves of the tree and they're defoliating it. I've seen wasps go in and continually drag out right through that disgusting web and drag out every one of those little caterpillars from there. So that makes me look at wasps in a different light. So if they're not attacking my bees and they are performing a service, I tend to let them be. Even these paper wasp nests that tend to be built near doorways and they're trying to get out of the weather. So let's say you don't like them and let's say you kill them. Here's also what I recommend. Don't take down that paper wasp nest. Leave it in place because guess what? They don't reuse it. And a large paper wasp nest in place that's not in use anymore is still a deterrent to other wasps that may want to build their nests there. So that's the other end of it. But as far as chiggers and things like that, I would say protect yourself in some way rather than trying to use any kind of herbicide, pesticide. You've used non-toxic herbal-based sprays. A lot of herbal-based stuff can still be detrimental in concentrated forms. So I would look at protecting yourself with some kind of repellent. And then, of course, when it comes to wasps, depending on the species, now there's some species of wasps that are terrible. Don't get me wrong. Bald-faced hornets, bull hornets, things like that. You see them feeding on your bees and things, yellow jackets in the ground, right in your garden. You might have to deal with those things. But the paper wasps leave their nests and sometimes just leave the wasp because you can come and go all day long. They don't even care. They're totally non-defensive. But they do take out a lot of pests, so worth it. Next one is from Damien in Melbourne. We hear that a hive inspection shouldn't take too long as the bees like to keep the hive temperature constant, but what length of time should we be aiming for before it's too long? Do we just rely on windows in the flow super to know when to harvest? Is it ever advisable to remove the flows in the super to inspect them? You can inspect them, but I've never had it go wrong when I've looked at the ends and of course the side panels when they fill out to the end there. Sometimes in the lower box, the bees can rise up through the middle in times of dearth and they can take out some of the honey that's stored in the center of your flow super. So the potential risk there, the absolute worst case scenario is that you draw off some honey that is unripe. So everyone should have a refractometer. A refractometer tells you what the water percentage is and you should be able to test the honey even while it's coming out. Now let's say you draw off some unripe honey. Let's say you misguessed it and you saw some cappings and you drew out the honey. It is not too late. It's brand new honey. It just came out of the hive. You can dehydrate that. So if you have a home dehumidifier, something like that, you can put that honey out in big open cake pans and you can run that dehumidifier in there, which will elevate the temperature in a small space, a closet, small bedroom, something like that, close off all the airflow, and it will dehydrate at like almost 2% per day. So if it's at 20%, you can have it down to 18 the following day. So you can deal with it if it comes out and it's not completely ripe. So I see that. Look for the cappings first, of course. I've never had it come out with too high a water percentage, but I just gave you a worst case scenario. You can dehydrate the honey later if you do it right away because we don't want it to start fermentation. So the other part of the question is, how long should an inspection take? When I'm inspecting a beehive, first of all, stage everything that you're going to need. So if you're looking at, we have a single brood box, we think it's building up, we want to know if we need to add a super now, and so we have a lot of things that we want to assess in the hive. We want to know if there's queen, so we can find that out fairly quickly because all we have to find are, if there's eggs in there, we've had a queen laying eggs within 3 days. Close it up. We're done. We found out what we need. We see the population of the hive. We pull off the cover, we pull off the inner cover, we're looking at the bees. Be prepared, so have your box ready to go, medium super or your flow super or whatever the next box is going to be if they're full. And if we see that they're full, now we're ready to do that all in the same visit. Also, if you've got feeders on, if it's the time of year that you're feeding, make sure that your feeders are on hot standby, that you've got sugar syrup or whatever you're going to feed them ready to go. So when you open the hive, we have the potential to do everything we need to tend that hive all at one time without having to, oh, they need feed, close it up, run back to your bee shed, mix up some sugar syrup, come back. 30 minutes later, you're back in the hive, opening them up again, smoking the hive, whatever you do to calm your bees. And now they've been invaded twice. So the shorter your interaction and the more pleasant the interaction. This is also why I bring sugar syrup. And if it's during the summertime, 1-to-1 sugar syrup with a couple of teaspoons of essential oils of your choice. And you mix that in there, and when I open up, I spritz them with sugar syrup and essential oil. And now they're preoccupied, they're tasting the sugar syrup. So then, every time I open it and they smell the essential oil, they associate that with a treat, which is sugar syrup. Every bee likes honey. Every bee likes sweets. Every bee likes sugar syrup. So when you spritz that, now they're calm and we're not smoking them. So that allows me to do a detailed inspection. So there's a difference between a hive evaluation and a hive inspection. You're inspecting with a very specific goal. What's going on? Do I have a queen? Do they have food? Do I need to expand? Be prepared to answer all of those questions with a material response. So I've got my box on hot standby. My frames are ready to go. So now we're going to inspect. We're going to get out of there. You should be in and out of a hive. 5 minutes is actually a pretty long time. If you're not making a video, I spend more time in my hives because I'm making a video or I'm explaining something which can take some time. In and out, the less you pull things apart, the better. So that's the other thing about these pulling out the flow frames. Every time you pull a frame out, the bees have to go back in and repropolize all of those joints that you've disrupted. Also, the bees are more disrupted. In other words, their infrastructure is arrested for the moment that you are pulling things apart. You lift the box off, you just broke all the connective tissue away. They also have sealed propolis and everything else around between the boxes. Every place where there's an interface, they're going to seal that with propolis. And this is a problem that beekeepers get into when we get to the end of the year. They start pulling things apart and putting things back together in a different order with different equipment, with pillow top boxes and all these Vivaldi boards and all this other stuff that people want to add at wintertime. Just as it's getting cold, when the bees cannot work wax anymore, when they cannot get propolis anymore, and you just took away the bees' decision-making ability when it comes to modifying, sealing up the interior of their hive. So the other thing is the time of year that we're pulling things apart. Minimal damage should always be the goal. Get your answers as quickly as possible and get out, and you'll find out. Your bees are going to be very happy that you did not spend a long time oohing and awing over all of those details. The other thing is time of day. Do your inspections in the early afternoon usually because we want as many foragers out of the hive as possible. The other thing is the higher the sun is, the easier it is for us to make visual observations inside the hive and see every frame and see what's going on. We can spot eggs better. We have natural light. The other thing is if the sun is at an angle, you can bring a mirror, an inspection mirror, for example, and the sun's coming over here. We reflect the sunlight down in there, and nothing is brighter than putting sunlight inside the hive to take a look at things. So now we are finally to the last question. By the way, if your question was not answered today, somebody will be getting back to you. We only have so much time. So the last question comes from Matthias, who's in northeastern Florida. Started with a nuke this spring. Nuke is short for nucleus colony. Again, as we mentioned before, that's with brood, that's a queen, that's all the stages of a colony existing. And close to my first honey harvest. Now we have a 3-part question. My bees are gathering outside over the hive entrance all the time. They like to hang there during the night as well. So far, no beard shape was formed, and I have a brood box and a super. How do I know if they're getting ready to swarm? When is it time to do a split? Okay, first of all, what is a split? Well, if the colony is filling out as is described here by Matthias, we're going to look again. This is one of those rapid inspections. It's got a lot of surplus bees on the front, but what's going on? The difference between bees that are just collected on the front and the difference between bees that are about to swarm is going to be in their activity level. The other thing is, do we smell honey in the air? When you go out in your bee apiary and you smell honey in the air, there's a nectar flow on, and the bees are venting heavily around that entrance. They're dehydrating the honey that's all been brought in. The nectar that goes into that hive occupies twice the amount of surface area because bees are smart. Bees are the smartest insects. What are they doing? They're bringing the nectar in and they're putting it in every open cell that they can find, every available cell. They create more surface area that allows them to dehydrate it quicker, and then at night what's going on? The storekeeper bees are in there and now they're moving it around again. And every time that they take that honey in and they move it to another cell, they're also going through another stage of dehydration of that nectar while they make honey. So what happens is you have a bunch of workers that are just plain in the way. You're a forager, you don't belong inside that hive, so they push them all out and they all congregate on the face of the hive. And that allows more surface area inside the hive to be accessible to the bees that are in there, moving the air through there. And I just recently did an evaluation of the air movement coming out of the entrance of a hive, and it is impressive how much air they can move through a single entrance. So they're moving a lot of air in there, and that's why your bees are outside. Even the bees that are hanging out in there that are unemployed, what are they contributing to the hive while they're in there? They're respirating. They're contributing to the humidity. They're in the way physically, so they're keeping the other bees from doing their jobs. That's why they're on the outside. That's also why near at the end of the year, when we're finishing up with nectar flows and things like that, and all the honey's on board and everything is loaded, you'll see an entire front of a hive full of bees. Does that mean they're about to swarm? No. So the thing about doing a split, what time of year is it? You don't want to do a split when we're ending a nectar flow. You want to do a split when we're in the middle of or we're beginning a nectar flow. What would show you that you could do a split? Well, are there drones around? You got to see lots of drones because when you do a split, you're going to make a new queen. The queen's going to have to do mating flights. She's going to need genetic material. If you've got drones, she won't mate with her own drones, but it's a pretty good indicator that there are other drones in the area, and drone congregation areas will be good places for your new queen to go and do her virgin flights. So, do you have queen cells? Do you have open larvae? Because if you've got open larvae, if you've got eggs, then you can pull those frames, put them in your new box, and they will make queen cells if you don't have them already. So based on population alone, open brood, eggs, extremely young brood, then they will make their own emergency queen cells if you split them up. So do you have just 3 frames of brood? Maybe you shouldn't split them. Do you have 5 or 6 frames of brood? Time to split them. So you could do that. Good to go. If they're already making queen cells, definitely split them. Why not benefit from those now? And hopefully those queen cells are not capped yet. But if they're actually queen cells, what's the difference between a queen cup and a queen cell? The queen cup is just an enlarged cell that looks like it could start a queen, but nothing's in it, no egg, nothing. Once the egg gets laid and once they start feeding that royal jelly, that became a queen cell. Once you have that, they're already going to swarm. They've already made up their mind. So now we have to create more space for them. These are the things that inspire them to swarm in the first place. Congestion, the number of bees. The bees will start to think they need to swarm. They've overgrown their space. How much ventilation is there? Too little. A sense of low ventilation creates a sense of congestion. So there again, another stimulus for them to swarm. Do they have enough resources to split them and survive? Yes, lots of resources coming in. Therefore, it's prime swarm season. It's also prime split season. So you could split the colony. Now, when you're doing that split, if they had the queen cells and stuff, when you're doing the split, should you take the queen with the split or should you leave them in that box? Take the queen, my opinion, with the split because she's about to be kicked out anyway. They've already decided they're going to replace her. Put her in the new box, leave the queen cells in the old box, let them replace the queen there because that's what they're going to do anyway. And now you've got a split, you've got another colony, and you're good to go and take a bunch of nurse bees with you there. So let's say you had 5 frames of brood here. Take 3 of them with a split and leave 2 because you've got all the resources and the bulk of the workforce there. That's what I say. So that is pretty much it. He did have one more part of this question. When it's time to harvest honey, the rule is to wait for 80% capping. Does that mean every flow comb has to be 80% capped? And how can I tell looking through the window? Much as I said before, by the time you see those edges getting capped, the field of honey is 9 times out of 10 is also capped. You look at the exterior through the windows. I believe the new Flow Hive 2 has windows on both sides, so you get to look and see on both sides if you want. Mine tend to load up on the southeastern side first, And once I see those being capped, you're good to go. So, and again, as I mentioned before, every beekeeper should have a refractometer, and you should get it calibrated. There are very expensive refractometers, like this one right here, which is specially designed just for honey testing, and as this is what inspectors use. Gives you an immediate response right there. Lets you know what the water percentage is, and there are the standard refractometers, $50, $40. Every beekeeper should have one, and then you'll know right then, because you're going to find that when you blend it all together, that it is going to be 17% is pretty average for what I've been pulling out of the flow hives. That's pretty much it. Oh, the other thing here is about moving hives. If I do a split to start a new one, the second hive, but like to locate the second hive on a different location about 80 feet away from the existing hive, is that a problem? I know if you move a hive, you have to do it either slow and with small steps, or move it 5 miles away. And I'm going to base this on my own experience because I do splits all the time. It's very easy to do. I do what's called walk-away splits. As I described before, I take the queen out, I put her in the new box, and that new box might only be 40 feet from the other one. Now, don't you risk losing the foraging bees because they still think they live at the old hive. You do. You're going to lose a bunch of foraging bees. That's why I take as many of the nurse bees. So the frames, so let's go back to what we described before. Let's say with the 5 frames of brood, and I put 3 in the new box. I take every frame and shake all the nurse bees into the new box. So 5 frames of nurse bees go in the new box. Why would I do that? Well, because the nurse bees have no clue where they live. They have not been outside of the hive. They haven't done any orientation flights. They can't leave that hive and go back to the new hive because they don't know what the outside world looks like. Their first experience of the outside world was me lifting the frames and shaking them into a new box. So they're going to stay. Plus, we have frames of capped brood in there, and they're going to be hatching out and replacing stuff. So they'll push the nurse bees into other jobs in that colony earlier than they otherwise would. So let's say we lose 100% of the foragers that went with those frames. That's fine, we don't care because we've got nurse bees that can't leave, that are just going to take over all the jobs. And then we've got newly hatching capped brood in there that are going to replace them as well, and they're going to take over the duties as nurse bees. So it is a very smooth way to split a colony, and it doesn't matter the distance you move them. I've done that, put them 2 hives over, and they've been just great for the reasons that I described. So thanks for watching. I hope some of the answers that you got today were beneficial, and thank you for being a part of the beekeeper.org.